Here for our third podcast, we're going to focus on the road to the Revolution. So we're going to look at the events from 1750 to 1775. Major topics to be covered today are the French-Indian War, Prime Minister Grenville and the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, Boston Tea Party, Intolerable Acts, and First Continental Congress. We'll try to keep this with about 10 minutes long, so feel free to follow along and jot down some notes. Here we go. So French-Indian War, we're not really going to talk about, what happened and all that stuff, any specific battles or whatever. If you are interested in the French-Indian War, go watch Last of the Mohicans. But anyways, France essentially gets booted out of North America. The British are incredibly successful. They get all this new land, but they also get a huge debt. Wars cost a lot of money. Okay, now the British basically argue that because this war was fought to protect the colonials, and that also because they're going to get all this new land, that they should help pay for their own defense. Okay, and since the British are going to keep some of their army in these 13 colonies, they're going to want some money, basically from the colonists. Okay, so that's going to lead to taxation, which is going to anger the Americans. Okay, so the British, they're dealing with this huge debt, but they also have this new gigantic empire. Okay. So the colonials start pouring into this newly won territory, especially the Ohio Valley. Okay, and they're excited because they just won this land, blah blah blah. But there's Native Americans there. Okay, and the Native Americans do not look too kindly on this infringement on their land, and so a bunch of Native Americans rise up around this great leader called Pontiac. Okay, and we have Pontiac's uprising. Okay, and these Native Americans go around attacking English settlements, destroying English forts all throughout the Ohio Valley. Several thousand settlers are killed, and it's not a good thing for the British. Okay, the British respond brutally. They start attacking villages, and some cases suggest that smallpox was spread on purpose, not large scale, but there is something to suggest that was the case. Okay. Basically, the British realize that they don't want this. They don't want this conflict with the Native Americans. They don't want to spend all this money fighting any of these wars. And so they passed what's known as the Proclamation Act of 1763, which prohibited the colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And this is going to infuriate the Americans because they're like, hey, we just fought a war to get all this land, and now you're saying we can't even go ahead and get this land and settle this land? That's a bunch of crap. And so basically they ignore this. Okay, so it shows a little defiance building up among the colonists when they pretty much flatly ignore this Proclamation Act of 1763. Okay, as I earlier alluded to, this French-Indian War had a huge debt that was racked up because of it. And this led to a bunch of very unpopular policies that were basically enforced by the British Empire. Okay, Prime Minister Grenville once again tries to address this debt by making the colonists pay for some of the bill. So a couple of things that happen here. Number one, the navigation laws, okay, which are part of this whole mercantilist policy the British have here. The navigation laws are enforced. Smuggling is cracked down on at pretty much trying to get tax revenue to go up. This is going to make many people in New England especially angry because they're used to smuggling and also trading with other countries. The Proclamation Act was previously discussed. We see a couple taxes thrown in here. The Sugar Act of 1764 taxed sugar coming from the West Indies. And the most hated of them all was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax put on pretty much any paper. And this really infuriated the Americans, the American colonists. Okay, they basically said that philosophically it was not okay to tax people without getting their representation, without getting their say. And so because the American colonists did not have a place in the British Parliament, the colonists therefore stated that they by right should not be taxed by this Parliament. Okay, and so the Stamp Act is really going to create a lot of resistance. Okay, the very famous saying was "no taxation without representation." Okay, as I kind of previously stated, there were no Americans in Parliament, but the British argued that there was something called virtual representation, which basically stated that all British politicians look out for the interest of all the British subjects, kind of like how every American congressman or every American senator looks out for the well-being of all Americans. Okay. Moving on, there's a fair amount of resistance to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act Congress is put together in 1765. It unsuccessfully beseeches for the British to repeal the act. What's probably more successful are the non-importation agreements and the Sons of Liberty. The non-importation agreements basically have the colonists boycotting British goods, and it's very effective considering that of all British exports, the colonists buy 25% of that stuff, and so that's a pretty big blow to the British economy, especially the textile industry. The Sons of Liberty are led by the very famous Samuel Adams, who is the cousin of future President John Adams. These guys rely on violence to send their message. One of the common things these guys did is they would tar and feather British officials, stripping them down naked, dumping hot tar over them, and then throwing feathers all over them. Okay, all this resistance basically convinces the British that, hey, you know what, this is not working out too well, and let's repeal this bad boy. And so the Stamp Act is repealed, and so the colonists are successful in getting this thing repealed. However, the British do pass the Declaratory Act, which states that they're going to repeal this, but they do have the right to tax the colonies. Okay, so the issue is going to come back. And the issue does come back in 1767 with a new British Prime Minister. He passes the Townshend Acts, okay, which once again are trying to pay for British administration of North America here. So we have taxes on things like glass, lead, paint, paper, and probably most infamous, tea. Okay, the colonists were very annoyed by this tea tax. Okay, mainly because they drink a lot of tea, obviously. But they felt like the tax on tea was unfair. Once again, no taxation without representation. And so we see smuggling of tea picking up, and basically the Bostonians are basically just flaunting their defiance towards the British Crown. And so the British feel like they have to respond. And so what the British do is they send troops into Boston to restore law and order, to make sure that the Bostonians follow the law. And infamously, we have this event called the Boston Massacre, where we have British troops basically firing on a mob, killing and wounding 11 people. Now, there's a lot of debate on what exactly happened, blah, blah, blah. Many people insist that the colonists were egging the British on. Some of the colonists insisted the British were bloodthirsty. This should be noted that the British officers were found innocent of murder here, so it kind of implies what probably actually happened here. Anyways, the effects of the Townshend Acts turns out to be really bad policy for the British. It really just angers the colonists to the point where they're getting closer and closer to independence. It didn't really raise any money. I think it raised like £295 in 1 year, while the British annual cost for administration of the colonies was £170,000. So basically, it really doesn't do any good. It just gets the colonists more fired up, more organized in resisting British colonial control. Anyways, more problems in Boston continue. The Boston Tea Party occurs in 1773. The British basically are trying to prop up the East India Trading Company, who's kind of struggling. They have this huge surplus of tea. So basically, they basically have the British East India Company be the only company that can sell tea to the Americans. And this really angers the Americans. Once again, they feel like they're being tricked into paying taxes, even though the tea is super cheap. They don't like it. So essentially, the Bostonians basically have this little tea party where they have 100-ish Bostonians board the British ships and dump the tea into the harbor. The British are going to respond very forcefully with the Intolerable Acts of 1774, also known as the Coercive Acts. Okay. So the Intolerable Acts are basically meant to punish Massachusetts for their actions. 2,000 troops are sent to Boston. The Boston Port Act is passed, which closes down the port of Boston, which is going to have a very big impact on the New England economy. Basically, self-rules taken away. Town meetings aren't acceptable anymore, and British soldiers are now not tried in American jerseys for crimes they commit. And also, the last thing that annoyed Americans quite a bit was this idea that they had to provide the lodgings for the British troops, known as quartering. Okay, now the whole entire American colonies, all 13 colonies, basically support Massachusetts. Flags are flown at half-staff. The rest of the colonies also send food to Boston to help them in this time of need. And finally, the first Continental Congress is formed. Okay, so in 1774, the first Continental Congress forms. Now, they're there for consultation. They don't really have any real power. We see the word Congress, and we assume that they can do things. Not so. John Adams, the fiery New Englander, he's going to be really, really pushing for this revolutionary stance. We're not at independence yet. Reconciliation is still the preferred model at this point. So 1774, we're not ready for independence yet. So important actions that are taken by the Continental Congress is they basically create a declaration of rights that they feel like they have and send it to the king. It gets rejected. They also send a petition to the king. Also rejected. And then finally, they pass what's called the Association, which is a complete boycott of British goods, which also is going to have a huge impact on the British. Okay, so anyways, that's all I have for you today. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, my website there with all my PowerPoints, also with all my podcasts. If you want to check them out, follow me on YouTube if you like as well, to find more videos from me. So anyways, thanks. Have a great day, guys.